Hello and welcome to our latest Hutted Histories talk. When we think of the medical services during the First World War, our minds always spring automatically to stretcher bearers carrying wounded men off the battlefields through the evacuation process of the regimental aid post and the casualty clearing stations and eventually down to the base hospitals. What we very rarely think about are convalescent soldiers. So what we're going to do this month is look at the uniforms of the convalescent soldier, known universally at the time as hospital blue. Once again, we're very fortunate that Private Morling, that splendid example of soldiery, has volunteered to help. Among your family photographs, many of you will have pictures of relatives convalescing during the First World War from wounds or sickness. If you look at the photographs, you can see the men not wearing their khaki uniforms that they wore on the battlefields, but wearing a shapeless, grey-looking garment with a different coloured tie. The blue hospital uniform was introduced during the Crimean War as a way of making convalescing soldiers and sailors instantly recognisable when they're out in public. With very few changes, the uniform would continue all the way through the First World War and in fact would see service in some overseas hospitals even into the early 1960s. However, there was a very strict set of rules and regulations which covered which kit could be worn at which times. So let's start at the beginning with patients who were completely bedbound. These patients, who were not well enough to get out of bed, in theory wore their pyjamas all of the time. The pyjama jacket, or jacket sleeping silver grey flannel to give it the correct name, was made of the same flannel material as the soldiers' greyback shirts. It fastened up the front with dish brass buttons and had a large pocket on the left breast. The trousers, rather confusingly, were called trouser, pyjama, sleeping, silver grey flannel. They were a simple garment fastened at the waist with a draw cord. Despite the fact that bedbound patients were only supposed to wear their pyjamas in bed, there is plenty of photographic evidence clearly showing men who were well enough sitting up in bed carrying out activities, wearing their blue jackets, white shirts and red hospital ties. As soon as a soldier was no longer bedbound and well enough to get out of bed, he had to wear the blue uniform around the hospital at all times, and if he was given permission to go off the hospital premises. So let's have a look at some of these elements of the uniform. Starting with the jacket, which is the most iconic item, but it was in fact never ever referred to as a jacket at all. It was in fact waistcoats, serge, blue. These waistcoats were available in lined and unlined versions, and the white collar that you can always see in photographs, which is so distinctive, was in fact not white at all. It was actually canvas, flax, number 1 grey, so it was an off-white, literally a grey rather than a white. Just to confuse the issue, not every piece of hospital uniform during the First World War was made of blue serge. If you look at hospital photographs taken in 1915 and early 1916, you can very often see patients wearing a much lighter coloured uniform. We believe that these had been bought from America as a stopgap until stocks of the hospital blue caught up with demand. They nearly always have a label in them which says convalescent coat. If these were a British military item, the term would be coats convalescent, not convalescent coat. So it's pretty sure that they certainly didn't originate in this country. and many of them do have a government acceptance arrow stamped in the back as well. Patients were issued with 3 of the standard hospital shirts, or shirts cotton. These were a loose, baggy, half-fronted white shirt, buttoned up to the neck with a stand and fall collar and buttoned cuffs. The baggy shape made it much easier to put on men with upper body wounds. There is no mention in any of the original documentation we've found which referred to ties. However, Handkerchief's cotton is clearly the term for the very distinctive red hospital tie. Despite the fact that patients were issued with 3 white cotton shirts, 3 pairs of socks and even 2 handkerchiefs, they were only issued 1 pair of drawers cotton. These were worn underneath their trousers, which were trousers serge blue, and again, as with everything else, were available in lined and unlined versions. And in fact, you can very often see the lined versions in photographs where the chaps have got the trouser legs rolled up and you can see the light grey turn-ups at the bottom. The trousers, as with all the rest of the garments, were made in very few sizes, and the waist had a draw cord, so you'd simply pull the waist in tight so that it fitted a wide range of sizes. And likewise, the leg length was always long, so the men simply rolled up the trouser legs in order to fit their leg length. There was another version of the trousers for psychiatric patients, or trousers mental patients as the label says. Instead of having the draw cord at the waist, which obviously could be used to do self-harm, these trousers had 3 small white buttons each side and a small length of tape with a buttonhole for adjustment. These garments were called gowns serge blue, and the design remains pretty much unchanged from the Crimean War until the end of the 1950s. They were also available in lined and unlined versions, fastened with white bone buttons, and were large and shapeless in order to fit over plaster casts and other wounds. The rank badges were worn on the right sleeve. In 1917, 2 new hospital garments were pattern sealed for use. The first was a new version of the hospital jacket. I hesitate to refer to it as waistcoat like the original for reasons which will become obvious any minute now. It featured an open collar, black buttons instead of white, and 2 patch pockets on the skirt. These were all made unlined. At the same time, an actual sleeveless waistcoat was introduced, so you can see why I was hesitant to refer to the new jacket as a waistcoat like the previous one. However, these were termed waistcoat, serge, hospital, new pattern. These waistcoats are rarely seen in photographs, but I believe that the 2 garments were introduced at the same time, and that the waistcoat was a kind of removable lining to prevent the need to make the new jackets in both lined and unlined versions. Both of these garments would continue unchanged throughout the Second World War and into the 1950s. The final item was a handkerchief, and every patient was issued with 2 of them. The artist, Stanley Spencer, was a Royal Army Medical Corps orderly at the Beaufort War Hospital in Bristol. After the war, he painted a number of murals on the wall at the Sandon Memorial Chapel in Burclair. One of them was entitled Sorting the Laundry, and clearly depicts a large heap of these red and white hankies about to go into the wash. There were a number of other specialist hospital garments as well, including Dresser's Ticken, which was the name of this one-piece striped overall for psychiatric patients. The overall was laced up the back and the sleeves folded across the front of the body and tied behind so the patient couldn't harm themselves. It was effectively a straitjacket. We always think of shell shock when we think of the First World War, but of course there were plenty of other cases of mental illness too. The staff at the King's Lancashire Military Convalescent Hospital in Blackpool devised a scheme to help administer their patients. The patients were all divided up into 4 separate sections, each of them identified by a different coloured armband. The worst cases wore their hospital blue uniforms with white armbands. Those cases who needed 1 to 6 months treatment wore pink. The third section included all those ranks who required less than a month of treatment, and they wore light blue armbands. The final section included all those who were practically well, and they had dark blue armbands. Each week the men were assessed by their medical officers and moved from one section to another depending on their condition. There was no hospital version of the greatcoat, so when soldiers were given permission to leave hospital premises, they wore their own khaki greatcoats if it was cold, with a blue armband over the top of their hospital blue uniforms. They always wore their own headgear as well, most of them obviously in caps, or Scottish regiments with Glengarrys or Balmoral bonnets or tam o' shanters. Rank badges were also worn on hospital blue, but only on the right sleeve by NCOs. And the badges were exactly the same badges that they wore on their khaki service dress. So as in the case of the sergeant here, literally just one set of sergeant stripes worn on his right sleeve in exactly the same place he would do on his normal jacket. And the jacket in this case is one of those late war jackets introduced in 1917. And you can see here he's got the late war soft service dress cap. And all those who'd been awarded medals or had got campaign medals, they would also wear the ribbons on their jackets as well. So if you're an old soldier who'd fought in Afghanistan or fought in the South African War, or if you'd been awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal or a military medal or maybe even a Victoria Cross, the ribbons of those would all be on those jackets so that you could recognise instantly a non-commissioned officer or a brave fellow soldier or an old campaigner. Commissioned officers were exempt from wearing hospital blue. Instead, they wore their own khaki service dress uniforms with a white armband with a red crown on it to signify that they were convalescing. Later in the war, many of them would wear the simple plain hospital blue armband that the men wore on their greatcoats. Officers were also spared having to wear flannel pyjamas. Most wore silk pyjamas which they'd either bought themselves or paid for with the personal clothing allowance if they were temporary officers. Plenty of documentation still exists which lists all these garments, but it's often very difficult to work out what's actually what. So I'd just like to thank my chum Toby Brayley for his help with this Hutted Histories talk. That pretty much covers everything that you're ever likely to need to know about convalescent uniforms of British and Commonwealth soldiers and officers during the First World War. If you've enjoyed this, and certainly hope that you have, please do think of subscribing to our YouTube channel, the Great War Huts YouTube channel, and feel free to suggest other ideas, other talks that we might give in future. In the meantime, thank you all very much indeed, and we'll see you next month.